Hello class. Today we are going to turn our attention to the Pacific theater of World War II and look at the war with Japan. So to do that, we need to refresh what's been going on with Japan since we last talked about them. What has happened with the Japanese economy and the social system of Japan? Well, it has become highly industrialized, right? Which means it needs resources. Plus, it has become very nationalistic with the idea that there is an inherent hierarchy in the world and that the Japanese deserve to be on top of that hierarchy because they are awesome and they are restoring their national glory that they had been knocked down from. If you'll recall, what inspired this nationalistic industrial rebirth in Japan? The United States showing up in 1853 and threatening to take military action if Japan didn't begin trading, right? And so Japan realizes that it is outmatched by the United States and European powers, and so it embarks on a massive industrialization, social reform movement campaign called the Meiji Restoration, and it does it quite effectively and efficiently, and it becomes highly industrialized in only 50 years. But of course, that means that it's going to need resources, and so the first step is it takes Korea because Korea is nearby. It is resource rich, and it had been sort of a Chinese possession for a long time, but China at this point has been dominated by the British. It is in no condition to really stand up to Japan. It tries. When Japan invades Korea, China responds with war in the Sino-Japanese War, but Japan beats China because Japan is industrialized and China is not. And this, of course, leads to the attempt at reform in China because they realize, holy cow, we not only are being dominated by the British and other Europeans, but also by the Japanese, who have always been inferior to us. And so they attempt these reforms, but it only lasts for 100 days because then the Empress short circuits them. So Japan will then later invade Manchuria. We've talked about this invasion. We haven't talked exactly about the incident that sets it off, called the Manchurian Incident or the Mukden Incident. That's the Japanese for it. Essentially, this is a pretext for invading Manchuria. The Japanese stage an attack on one of their rail lines, claiming that the Chinese attacked the rail line, and that therefore the Japanese in self-defense can go in and seize control of this territory to secure it. This is, it's made up. Most people do not believe it, but it is the pretext. And this may sound familiar to you if we talked about the Nazis' excuse for invading Poland in September of 1939. You had the Nazis took a bunch of German corpses, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and put them just inside the border between Poland and Germany on the German side, and claimed that the Polish had tried to invade Germany, and that's why it was okay for them to seize Danzig and invade Poland. Of course, again, this was made up. So while these events are separated by a good 8 years, it's similar in that both countries are looking, they're very aggressive, they're looking for an excuse or some sort of flimsy justifier for why it's okay for them to attack a neighbor. And in both cases, people largely don't believe it. Some people are fooled at the time, but it's pretty clear that these are just excuses. Who's supposed to, step in and tell Japan not to invade Manchuria? Well, that would be the League of Nations. What do? They shake their fist at Japan and say, hey, stop that, you can't do that. And Japan says, well then, sure, we quit, because we are not going to leave Manchuria. So they quit. Japan manages to dominate Manchuria, secure its hold there. Manchuria not only has a lot of valuable resources, but it also will act as a launching base for a later invasion of the rest of China, which is to come. All right, so it's the 1930s. So what is sweeping through the world? That's the Great Depression. And the Great Depression hits Japan just like it hits everywhere else. It hits it hard. Half of all the factories close. People are desperate. Um, Unlike the European and American response, however, the Japanese respond faster than the West. The government takes action. It has less of a long term relationship with the capitalist idea of laissez faire. And so it is more willing to intervene more quickly. And so it issues massive government expenditures to create jobs, which, of course, by putting people back to work, you are putting money in their pockets, which is creating a new consumer base and leads to a quicker recovery. That's not to say that this isn't a painful process, but the Great Depression, Japan recovers from it faster, even faster than Hitler's able to engineer in Germany. Um, Japan engineers a recovery faster. Um, what type of economics is this idea where you spend money during a crisis to help the people as opposed to cutting back on government expenditures, even though your tax revenue is going to be going down because the economy is going down? Yep, that's Keynesian economics. So these expenditures are going to be targeted towards more industrialization. So it kicks that up another notch, rivaling the surge that we're seeing in the USSR under what were Stalin's plans called the 5-year plans. And so this you're going to see the fastest growth of electricity in the world will be in Japan at this time. And with the introduction of the assembly line, Japanese manufactured goods are going to rival the quality of those in the West. They will start doing some more exporting. Still not a ton, only 3.6% of the global export economy at this point, but you will see Western countries and America start to complain about having to compete with Japanese exports. So even though it's still a small part of that pie. So sort of echoing what we see today, only on a much larger scale with competing with Chinese exports, for example. All right, so the Japanese government and the leaders. The Japanese military has become increasingly influential in the government during this time. There will be multiple coups, attempted coups, in the 1930s. They will not succeed, although they will succeed in assassinating a prime minister. The coups will be put down by other military leaders, so more moderate military leaders such as Hideki Tojo. General Tojo is a more moderate military leader, although still expansionistic, but not quite as hardline as the initial coup leaders. But in putting these hardliners down, these more moderate military leaders will still take a big foothold in the government. So, for example, Tojo will become prime minister of Japan. And so the military is going to have a lot of say and direction in the government. At the same time, you're seeing an increase in nationalism. Japan was already nationalistic. We saw that as the response against the West intervening, the United States coming in and pushing Japan around. But now you're seeing even more that, you know, the government response to the Depression was good, but the Depression itself was the fault of Western values, a failure of Western systems. And so the Japanese way is the better way to do that. It's also a response to the Japanese political parties being very divided. These new parliamentary systems, new parties, they're squabbling with each other. It seems to be dividing Japan, and nationalism is a way of uniting the people, of overcoming those political divisions, as well as keeping workers in line with the increased industrialization. You're seeing workers and treatment of workers lead to calls for unionization, and authoritarianism coupled with nationalism is a way of keeping workers in line. Hey, you are a small part of a bigger plan. You need to just stick in your little role and help us build the glory of Japan. To disagree with the government is disloyal. You should know your place. Be proud of being a Japanese citizen. You know, the typical hyper nationalistic attitude. So what we wind up with is military leaders who are keen to expand and continue to build the empire for the glory of Japan and for additional resources to make more weapons and continue to modernize their weaponry. And business leaders who are also on board because expansion means more resources, which means more profit. So that brings us to Japan's second invasion of China in Manchuria. this time in 1937. It will use Manchuria as the launching point for invading the rest of China. Why 1937? What's going on in China? Well, for some of you listening to this lecture, we may have covered this already. For some of you, we haven't, and we will be doing so soon. But China is in the middle of a civil war right now. The two groups are the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists represent the government. They're not quite nationalistic in the same way as, for example, the Germans or the Japanese are at this time, but they're called the nationalists, and they're your capitalists basically, and they're the ones in charge of the government. They're fighting Mao Zedong's communist rebels, and it's a pretty long civil war. It will span about 2.5 decades. It will be interrupted by World War II. Basically when the Japanese invade. So the Japanese look at China fighting itself, divided amongst itself, and it says, hey, this is a good time for us to invade. And so it does. And it's going to take China a little while to get their act together and start calling a truce between the nationalists and the communists to be able to fight the Japanese. So for now, let's just think about what this means in terms of World War II. Right? When did World War II start? Well, in Europe, there's a clear date. When did World War II start in Europe? What provoked that beginning? That would be the German invasion of Poland in September 1st, 1939, and then the declarations of war from Britain and France on Germany in retaliation or in response to Germany invading Poland. In the Pacific, there's not quite a nice, clear, specific date for the start of World War II. You could argue that it starts in 1931 when Japan first invades Manchuria. You could argue that it's 1937 when it invades the rest of China because of this lag of about 6 years. Of course, Japan has also been expanding in other ways during those 6 years. So it's a point of argument. You could make a case for a couple different dates in the Pacific, but the bottom line is that you should definitely know it starts in 1939 in Europe. And in the Pacific, you should know it starts earlier than that, right? It has started well before Europe in the Pacific. And so the Asian belligerents will be fighting longer. It starts sooner in Asia, and it lasts longer in Asia than in Europe. And of course, the United States has a much smaller slice of this fighting because it starts fighting 2 years after the war in Europe starts, which is after the war in the Pacific starts, right? So the United States is in this a lot longer than it was in World War I, but it is still in a comparatively shorter amount of time than the other belligerents in this war. So that brings us to the question of what is the United States doing? At this point, the United States is pretty isolationist, and it's claiming to be neutral. But is it really, right? What is the relationship between the United States and China? They're trade partners, right? And yes, the United States is also trade partners with Japan. The United States is the group that demanded Japan start trading, right, and open those ports. But China has a much larger population than Japan. So when push comes to shove, if you're going to pick between China and Japan, China is the one that is more strategic to U.S. economic interests. So when Japan invades China and the League of Nations issues its condemnation of that action, though the United States is not part of the League of Nations, as you will recall, it joins in that condemnation. And so then the United States continues to trade with China. While China is at war, what will it be buying from the United States? It will be buying guns and other weapons and other tools of war. So how is Japan going to see this? Is the United States really neutral from the point of view of the Japanese? It gets even more contentious when the United States starts slapping sanctions on Japan for what it's doing to China, limiting what resources can be sold to Japan and trying to punish Japan economically to get it to stop attacking China. Japan's going to be very upset by this. Now, again, Japan, the Japanese are the aggressors here. But from the Japanese point of view, the United States is claiming to be neutral when it's acting very not neutrally, right? It's helping supply China with guns. It's limiting Japan's access to trade markets. It has censured Japan. to the Japanese, the United States isn't neutral, and things are only going to get worse. So again, when Japan thinks that war between the United States and itself is inevitable, this is part of what's factoring into that calculation. But it doesn't immediately attack the United States. First, it's going to continue to expand its empire. So it's going to take advantage, once war starts in Europe, it's going to take advantage of the fact that the Europeans are preoccupied defending their own territory in Europe, and they can't defend their colonies in the Pacific, right? So Japan is going to seize French Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. It's going to take Siam, which had been independent. It's going to take British Myanmar or Burma. It's going to attack New Zealand. It's going to attack and take Hong Kong. The British Dutch Indonesia down here. It has not yet taken the Philippines, but it is encircling them, right? Because who owns the Philippines? The United States. And so if it were to attack the Philippines, the United States would start going to war with Japan. So Japan is trying to take care of all these other islands whose owners, whose colonial overlords are preoccupied fighting in Europe. And so therefore it's easier to conquer this territory. That said, it's not easy to conquer this territory. The death rate is high. First of all, the Japanese treat the inhabitants of these territories, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Indonesians, as subhuman. Just like the other hyper-nationalistic societies we've seen, the colonizing British, the American treatment of Native Americans, the German treatment of the conquered territory in Namibia and in Europe, they look at the people they're conquering as subhuman, and therefore they are not hesitating to use violence to wipe out populations wherever they see fit. And so the Japanese, the death toll is going to be pretty atrocious. The Japanese are going to claim that they need this territory for quote unquote living space. That should sound familiar. Where have we heard that before? We've heard the Germans demand Lebensraum, and that's why they needed to annex Austria and the Sudetenland, etc. We've heard Euro-Americans make the same claim when taking land from Native Americans. You've heard it from European colonizers when moving into Africa, Australia, etc. So we've heard these claims before. It's not just the colonized people, though, that are being killed. They're fighting back against the Japanese, and the Japanese are coming up against some stiff resistance, especially considering they're not used to fighting in these territories. Not only do they not have local terrain over the local knowledge of the terrain. There you go. It's not their land. Also, it's also unfamiliar climate. So Japan is it's in a temperate climate zone. It's similar to Korea, obviously right there on the same line of latitude. It's not jungles. Whereas down here in Indonesia, in Vietnam, this territory is very unlike the territory Japan is used to having or trying to conquer in Manchuria or Korea. So it gets very muddy, wet. They're not used to fighting. The Japanese boots are like falling apart in the mud. So they're having to adapt, and it is slowing them down, although they are still able to make these territorial gains. Right? So they're adding and adding and adding to their empire, but they're steering clear of the United States because they don't want to draw the United States into a war before they are ready to fight them. So why do they? Why do they, quote unquote, wake the sleeping giant? The United States was referred to by the Japanese as the sleeping giant. It's a huge country. A lot of people, a lot of resources, but so far asleep. So far not actively involved in the war, although again, messing with the Japanese invasion of China in a way that the Japanese do not appreciate. So why are they ultimately going to wind up provoking a war with the United States? Well, the Philippines are still in the way of their empire building, right? The U.S. has territory that's smack dab in the middle of what the Japanese are trying to conquer. And that is a security threat that they cannot allow. Plus, the Philippines have a lot of resources that the Japanese want. There's the fact that the U.S. is messing with Japan's ability to take China. So if the Japanese knock out the U.S. Navy, the U.S. won't be able to run guns to China, and that would weaken China and hopefully make it easier for Japan to conquer the rest of China. Um, they also think that this is inevitable, right? As Japan continues to build its empire, eventually the United States is going to respond because shipping lanes will start to be challenged, territory that the United States values will be challenged, and so it's just a matter of time in Japan's from Japan's point of view. Plus, Japan thinks that eventually the U.S. Will be forced to reach a stalemate with Japan, and they will be able to sue for peace. And suing for peace doesn't mean going to court; it means basically asking for peace and negotiating a peace. Um, and Japan thinks that it can do that because, first of all, it's dominated Russia, it's dominated China, it's taken Korea. I mean, it's fought and won against a bunch of bigger countries. Granted, the U.S. is more industrialized than those other countries, but Japan has self-confidence. Additionally, it has the world's third largest navy. This is going to be a war fought mostly in the water. Japan's navy rivals the other major world powers. So Britain has the biggest navy, but it's busy, obviously, fighting a war in the Atlantic. And the United States has the world's second largest navy. But Japan has the world's third largest navy, which is nothing to sneeze at, and it has the world's largest battleship at this time. So it feels pretty good. Battleships were important in World War One. It's a way of measuring the size and strength of your navy. It's got the biggest one. Right? So its plan, as you know, will be to bomb Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. It's the naval base in Hawaii. Why did the United States take Hawaii? Why did it add it to U.S. territory? The inhabitants didn't ask for this, so why did the United States seize Hawaii? It's all the way out here in the middle, almost the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? Very far away from U.S. territory on the mainland. So it is a strategic refueling port on the way to trade, for example, to get resources from the Philippines, to trade with China, to trade with Japan. It's also the site of a naval base to cut in half the time it takes to respond to any sort of strategic issues in the Pacific, right? Instead of launching all the way from California. So, in the Japanese military mind, if they take out Pearl Harbor, knock it out, then the Americans will be slowed down in their ability to respond. The Japanese can finish gobbling up a bunch of islands, including the Philippines, and then by the time the United States can react, the Japanese will have gotten what they want. They will tell the United States, hey, look, we'll probably fight a few battles, and then they will sue for peace and say, let's redraw the territory, we can draw it here, you guys can have this half, and we Japanese people will take over here, right? That's the plan. Now, is this a good plan? Well, if this were an in-person lecture, I would ask you to discuss that, but instead I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, yeah, it's not a bad plan. It makes sense. It's pretty strategic. If things had gone according to plan, it may have worked, although still probably not as well as the Japanese wanted it to because they do miscalculate a few things. But if they had been able to successfully knock out the naval forces at Pearl Harbor, which they almost do, then it might have worked, or at least it definitely would have worked better than what wound up actually happening. So we're going to look at Pearl Harbor and the attack there and what happens. And then we'll look at why Japan doesn't wind up winning this war despite this plan. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, right? This is a date you need to know. It is essentially the 9/11 of this generation, okay? So the Japanese launch a surprise attack on U.S. naval base. Now, I have surprise in quotes because the American people did not know this was coming. But technically, the Japanese declared war on the United States before the attack began. They declared war that morning. They declared war without enough time for it really to be communicated to the U.S., decoded, or at least translated, and then run up the various the various levels of the chain of command to get to the people who really needed to realize that now Japan had declared war for the United States to be ready to actually defend itself. So, for all intents and purposes, this was a surprise attack for the military, for the American people. But the Japanese did declare war, technically, before they began the attack. Why would they go through that trouble of declaring war, but in such a way that the United States won't really know that they're at war? Well, as a way of preserving national honor and saying, hey, we didn't launch a surprise attack, we did declare war, so we don't have to feel bad, right? Still an honorable war. So sort of a very sneaky loophole, if you will. The goal, again, we've talked about, is to get the U.S. Navy out of the way. So I am going to play for you the only live recording we have of this attack.
And now we take you to Honolulu. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KTU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning the distant view, the battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked and considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. It is no joke, it is a real war. One moment, please.
Okay, so that, thank you. Okay, the attack, it's an attack on a military target, right? So there are about 2,400 U.S. service members killed and over 1,000 wounded. Now, the vast number of deaths are military deaths. Now, I'm not saying that makes it okay, but it's a military attack on a military target. There are civilian casualties. Almost 70 people are killed, 35 are wounded. The response by the United States. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, he declares war on Japan. This is what brings the United States formally into World War II, and we've talked in a previous lecture about how that ultimately gets the United States involved in the European theater as well. As you'll recall, because Hitler makes a deal to declare war on the United States in exchange for Japan declaring war on Russia. Japan does not declare war on the Soviet Union. Now, the U.S. Declaration of War, this is where you have FDR's famous speech declaring that December 7th, 1941 is a day that will live in infamy. Infamy is basically being famous for bad things, right? So if somebody is infamous, they're notorious for something. So the United States declares war on Japan. It is attacked, and in retaliation, it joins a war. There's a major uptick in the number of volunteers, right? That the United States will still use a draft for World War II, but there is a surge in volunteers, people eager to go to war to defend their country after this, this horrible attack, the surprise attack, eager to go fight the Japanese. There's national outrage. People are aghast. There's a massive influx of racism, especially against Japanese Americans, not just people in Japan, but people of Japanese descent in America. This is where you will see the internment camps be created, Japanese populations being rounded up and forced into those camps, all of which hopefully you will study in much more detail in U.S. history, or you can contact me if you have questions about the policy and where the camps were and why and all of that. You see an uptick in hate crimes against Japanese Americans and American residents of Japanese descent. So what I would like you to do is compare and contrast December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, with September 11th. And in what ways are these similar? And in what ways are they different? Right? That's what I would like you to think over. Because I called this the September 11th of this generation. So, in how many respects is that accurate, and in how many is it not? Okay. So, the next thing I want us to do is to analyze um, data to see if you can figure out why the United States was able to beat Japan, even though the Japanese plan made it so that the United States shouldn't have, right? So I'm going to show you some charts here, and I just want you to look them over and see if you can come up with a theory as to why the United States was still able to beat Japan. Okay. So here we have warship production numbers. Merchant ship production numbers. Merchant ships help you get supplies where they need to go. And aircraft production numbers. What really stands out to you here? What is a reason that Japan would lose this war with the United States? Because, spoiler alert, they lose World War II. Why Japan really lost the war? Japan woefully underestimates U.S. industrial capacity and the level to which the United States is able to mobilize. They knew that the United States economy was bigger than Japan's economy and the resource base was bigger, but they didn't think the United States could mobilize it as fast as it did, that it will be a sort of total mobilization that we have already talked about, and that they could crank out as much as they did. By the late 1930s, the Great Depression is still going on. The United States has nearly twice the population of Japan, 17 times Japan's national income, 5 times more steel production, 7 times more coal production, all things you need to conduct a war, right? To make weapons and tanks and ships. And 80 times the automobile production, Jeeps, for example. And keep in mind, the United States, like it did in World War I, will command factories to produce war materials. So if you were a car factory, now you can make tanks for the war, right? If you were making, merchant ships, well, now you might be making aircraft carriers, right? The other problem, Japan's Navy, even though it's really big, it's not actually suited to World War II warfare. It had been battling an outdated Russian military back in the Russo-Japanese War, or an under-industrialized Chinese military. But now, taking the Japanese Navy against the U.S. Navy, the Japanese Navy is prepared for World War I. It has a lot of battleships, and these were important in World War I. But a battleship is a ship where you need to be in firing range to, and therefore most likely visual range, to attack your target, be that a land target or another battleship. The U.S. has more aircraft carriers, and aircraft carriers carry aircraft, and the aircraft can fly, right? That you can leave your aircraft carrier far away from the danger zone, send your pilots out to bomb and target and do recon, and then they can come back. And if you lose a pilot, that's not okay, obviously, but it's easier to replace a plane than an entire ship, right? So aircraft carriers are the new most important feature for naval warfare, and the Japanese have very few of those. And they're going to get really unlucky, and within one of the first couple major battles, they will lose 4 of their 6 major aircraft carriers. And so it's pretty unfortunate for the Japanese. They get pretty unlucky there, right? The U.S. got really lucky with Pearl Harbor because the aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers. And so they weren't docked in the harbor for the Japanese to bomb. And so if they had been, then again, that's what I was talking about when I was saying, hey, this could have gone more to plan for Japan and it might have been a little bit more successful. That was a major unlucky draw for the Japanese. So how is this war in the Pacific Theater fought? First of all, and this is very important, most of the fighting is between Japan and China in China. So most of it is land warfare on Chinese soil, just like in Europe. Between whom is most of the fighting? Between Germany and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Even though they don't get featured a lot in most World War II movies, right? And they don't get a lot of credit. It's the same in the Pacific. It's mostly between Japan and China. It's been going on longer. There's more soldiers involved, bigger battles. Japan and China. But they don't get a lot of airtime on American movies, and because again, the Chinese will eventually become communist, much like the Soviets, so the Americans don't want to give them a lot of credit. And additionally, the Americans aren't as involved, so American media tends to focus on what America has done, right? But most of the fighting is between Japan and China. The U.S. isn't going to deploy troops in China to battle the Japanese there or help China. Most of U.S. ground troops are going to Europe to fight the Nazis and the Italians. Right? So the United States is going to use a technique called island hopping. And this is where you hop from island to island, but not every island. There's a lot of islands in the Pacific and a lot of islands that the Japanese have taken. The Americans are only concerned with strategic islands. Islands that have specific resources they need, islands that can act as refueling points, or islands such as Iwo Jima, which could be used if a ground invasion is necessary to take the rest of Japan, the quote-unquote home islands, the 4 islands of Japan's main territory. Those are the islands that the Americans are going to spend their resources and their troops on. Right? So there's going to be a lot of battles. Major important battles include the Battle of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, the Guadalcanal campaign. We don't really have time to go into detail. Midway is where Japan loses a lot of their aircraft carriers. The Battle of Coral Sea is kind of a tactical victory for Japan because they sink more battles, but the Allies managed to stop the Japanese advance, so that's a big deal. And then Guadalcanal is actually a campaign of a bunch of different battles on the ground, in the air, on the sea, but it marks basically a turning point in the war against Japan. Iwo Jima is famous for the monument that gets created from this photograph from the aftermath of the battle, where you have 4 American troops raising the American flag on top of Mount Suribachi. What's really neat about this is that you can actually see one of the troops was a Navajo code talker. So a Native American tribe called the Navajo were recruited to use their language, which had never been written down, and to create a code for communications for American troops, because the Japanese cracked every code that the Americans could come up with until this one. And so the U.S. government, which had slaughtered and dispossessed and disenfranchised the Native American population, including the Navajo, then turned to the Navajo people and asked for help in World War II. And there were quite a few Navajo people who volunteered and signed up to do this. And without them, it's a whole different war in the Pacific, because the Japanese kept breaking American codes, right? So anyway, one of those soldiers, if you see on the monument that's built in D.C., you can see a Navajo prayer blanket that's in his satchel, which is pretty neat. Navajo were the first on the beach and the last off the beach, because they had to be the ones calling in the airstrikes and calling in the troop movements. And they were under orders to commit suicide if they were ever captured, not to be taken alive. And their commanders were ordered to kill them rather than allow them to be taken, because that code was so important to U.S. military interests. Okay, so if you ever go to DC and see this monument, it's really neat because it's built in the middle of like a circular drive, and so when you drive around it, it's built at such an angle that it actually looks like the flag is being raised as you drive around it. It's pretty cool. All right, the United States will also be bombing the home island, so not a ground invasion, but aerial assaults, much like in Germany, right? The German assault on the British, but also then the American counter assault once the Americans get involved, bombing Germany. So bombing the home islands. The home islands are the main Japanese islands. Again, the Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. The U.S. uses fire bombs, especially in Tokyo, targeting Tokyo in a big way. Keep in mind that while Japan has become more industrialized and factories are made out of concrete and metal supports, a lot of people's homes are still built out of wood. A lot of rooms are divided by rice paper walls as opposed to like bricks, for example. So using fire bombs is catastrophic for these cities and the people in them. The cities turn into literal infernos. People are burned alive. In Tokyo alone, somewhere between 75,000 and 200,000 civilians are killed. Roughly a million people are displaced. Um, the total with all of the firebombing campaigns is somewhere between 250,000 and almost a million people being killed. Right? And these are people. These aren't soldiers necessarily. These are industrial workers. These are parents. These are children. These are school kids. These are people who live in cities, right? And the United States is targeting these cities because they're industrial centers. So they are a way of sapping Japan's industrial capacity, their ability to wage war. But civilians are being killed, just like the German approach to, hey, what counts as a military target, really? If you're putting military supplies on ships and sending them with civilians on top, is that not a fair target? The Geneva Conventions would say no, it's not a fair target. The Geneva Conventions would say no, firebombing a city is not okay. But that is what the United States does during World War II. This is eventually where you're going to see kamikaze pilots come about. So, kamikaze, if you remember, is the Japanese word for divine wind. It's the wind that supposedly saved them from the Mongol invasion back in the 1200s. And now what you have is pilots that are being trained to do suicide runs. So initially, this wasn't official government policy. The earliest kamikazes launched suicide attacks, flying their planes into the sides of American ships and American targets out of desperation. But by the end of the war, Japan's industrial capacity will be so sapped that that they will be basically essentially building gliders out of wood and cloth and putting in teenagers who have only been taught how to take off and not how to land, with some explosives strapped to these essential gliders, and they will be told to, for the glory of Japan and for their honor, to launch themselves into American military targets. So that's where that comes from. At this point, the Japanese soldiers are kind of stalemated in China. The Chinese have managed to get their act together. Mao Zedong is leading peasant armies against Japanese forces. So the war in the Pacific, it's brutal. It's brutal. There's something called the Rape of Nanjing. This occurred back when Japan invaded Manchuria. It's a Japanese genocide against the Chinese inhabitants there. It lasts 6 weeks, starting the day that the Japanese invade. It's a campaign of mass murder, mass looting, mass rape. You can see a smiling Japanese soldier holding the head of a decapitated Chinese citizen. Babies being murdered and thrown onto, spikes. There are reports of Japanese soldiers playing soccer with severed Chinese heads. It is, words can't describe the horror. And somewhere between 50 and 300,000 Chinese civilians are murdered. Right? This type of brutality, like I said, this is what we see in hyper-nationalistic, militaristic societies. Right? The genocides we've seen from other colonial powers, the genocides we're going to see during World War II in Europe. Right? This is still a problem between China and Japan today. Japan has never apologized to China for this, and this is still a point of contention, a very sore spot between China and Japan. Other atrocities that are committed, prisoners of war are not treated well. So again, Japan is looking at the conquered territory or the conquered peoples as inferior, subhuman. one primary example of this is the Bataan Death March. This is where thousands of Filipino soldiers, resistors, and several hundred American soldiers will be forced on an over 70-mile march, not given enough food or water, beaten, brutalized. Thousands of Filipinos will be killed on this march. Up to 600 Americans will be killed on this march. Kamikaze pilots, of course. The treatment of Korean, Vietnamese, and other occupied populations, as I've said. Let's see. To give an accurate overview of this war, Americans are also committing atrocities, firebombing a civilian population, the atomic bomb, which we will talk about, Japanese internment camps in the United States. Now that is not as bad as, say, the Nazi death camps, and it's not the brutality that we see in the rape of Nanjing, but you are still taking people's communities and tearing them apart, rounding them up, depriving them of their liberty, their right to property. You're destroying livelihoods. You're stealing years from people's lives. So it's still very bad, right? It's still definitely an abuse of human rights, although not on the same level as you have with the rape of Nanjing or the Nazi death camps. And of course, inside the United States too, you still have segregation. You still have lynchings with black populations being killed and nothing being done about it. No accountability. So there's still plenty of terribleness in the world. This brutality is in part due to the Japanese mentality of not surrendering, of this being a point of national honor, of this being a do or die moment, that they are awesome and they can succeed regardless. It's a fight to the death. Sorry, the picture's covering that up there, but it's a fight to the death. Japanese civilians will be told that Americans will eat their children and murder them. So they are, there are instances of housewives taking up kitchen knives, trying to fight American soldiers in Japanese islands that are being taken over in their colonies. So it's pretty bad. But on the American side too, there's a lot of racism as well. So not only the Japanese racism of, hey, we're better and we can do this and we can do whatever we want, we won't surrender, but then and then the racism against the American forces. But you've got American racism too. Remember, Americans won't even trust their own Japanese citizens to fight in the Pacific because they don't think they're trustworthy because of their racial identity. You have Americans looking at Japanese people as inferior, so there's less hesitancy against using violence. There's more brutality against captured prisoners of war, etc. Okay, so I'm not, okay. A lot like we see on the Eastern Front, right? That kind of brutality. All right, so the war, it will eventually end. So first it ends in Europe. Victory in Europe, VE Day. Okay, Italy gets taken by the Allies. We talked about that. Mussolini is executed by anti-fascist parties in Italy. So the Italians execute Mussolini. His body is dragged through the streets, beaten, spit upon. It is not a glorious end for Mussolini. You don't have to remember the exact date that happens, but you should know it's 1945. You should know it's the springtime of 1945, and you should know it definitely happens before Germany. Because Germany falling, this is why Hitler murders his new bride, Eva Braun, and then kills himself and orders his body to be burned, cremated, specifically because he does not want to have happen to him and his corpse what happened to Mussolini. So you need to remember Mussolini was killed first, and the treatment of Mussolini's body is what inspires Hitler to make sure it cannot happen to him. This will give rise to conspiracy theories that Hitler isn't really dead, that he escaped to Argentina. Well, a lot of Nazis did escape to Argentina and other places around the world. Hitler died. He killed himself. There's forensic evidence. He's dead. Okay. So VE Day, May 8th, 1945. This is the famous picture in Times Square of a random soldier kissing a random nurse out of joy. The fall of Germany is pretty bleak at the end. Germany is desperate. Again, they have these ideas of never surrendering, and it's awesome. And Germany, how could it fall? And you've got 8-year-olds being given guns in Berlin from the Hitler Youth and being told, hey, shoot at the invading armies. So that scene from Jojo Rabbit, if you've seen Jojo Rabbit, that's not made up. That is, I mean, it's a fictional story, Jojo Rabbit, but it's based on, that's an actual thing that was happening, right? But just because the war in Europe is over doesn't mean the war in the Pacific is. The U.S. does not want to keep fighting in the Pacific. The American people are tired. They want to go home. They've been fighting for 4 years, which again is less time than the Chinese or the English, but they don't want to keep fighting, right? Japan is obviously not going to surrender. The fight is going to be bloody. American military leaders think it's going to cost millions of American and Japanese lives. Every last man, woman, and child the U.S. believes is going to fight kind of to the death because of what they've been encountering on the Japanese colonial territories and what they're observing. U.S. troops are in Europe, so it's going to take a long time to get them to the Pacific. So it's going to drag this out even more. Plus, they want to go home, you know. There's also no staging ground to mount a massive land invasion. You know, Japan's a series of islands, so this is going to be tactically difficult. And the longer it lasts, the more likely the Soviets are to get involved, right? Because what was that agreement at Yalta and Potsdam? What's the deal about ending this war? Whatever you liberate, you rebuild. So this would give the Soviets, as they reposition their troops from fighting the Germans to now taking a stand in the Pacific, it will give the Soviets more and more territory to rebuild, and that would mean giving more communism more of a foothold in China, in Korea, in ultimately Japan. And so the United States, at this point, being led by Harry Truman, who does not trust Stalin, he hates communists, he's paranoid about the communists. This is not a scenario that he wants to entertain. And then, of course, you also have an element of racism, right? You can see we did not drop an atomic bomb in Europe. We were willing to drop an atomic bomb on an Asian population twice, right? So that brings us to the atomic bomb. The atomic bombs, first one is dropped on Hiroshima, August 6th, 1945. Between 90 and 166,000 people are dead. Hiroshima is targeted because it's the site of industrial capacity, but again, these are civilian workers. Right? This is not a military target in the same way that, say, Pearl Harbor was, where it was actually a naval base. The United States drops this bomb, then drops a bunch of leaflets saying that we will drop another one if the Japanese government does not surrender. The Japanese government does not surrender, so a second bomb is dropped in Nagasaki on August 9th, 3 days later. An additional 39 to 80,000 people are killed. Okay. The United States had made 2 bombs. Why 2? Specifically to convince Japan that we could make more than 1. Okay. The United States only made 2 bombs. The U.S. Threatened to continue dropping bombs until Japan surrendered. But it was the world's biggest bluff because we did not have a 3rd bomb. But Japan believes the United States, and it surrenders unconditionally on August 15th. That is VJ Day, victory over Japan. This is where the peace sign comes from. The V for victory, right? I told you turn it around, that's flipping the bird in Europe, but if you put it forward with the outside of your fingers facing out, that's the V, stands for victory, which is where we get peace, right? Victory and peace. So the project was called the Manhattan Project. That is what developed these bombs. Again, the United States only made 2. It built 2 specifically to prove it could. When the first test was done, one of the scientists, Oppenheimer, remarked, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds," which is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita from the Hindu god Shiva. Basically saying, like, this kind of destructive force has never been seen before. The United States was able to develop this project in large part because of German Jewish scientists who had been run out of Europe because of Hitler. So again, another reason that attacking your own people is not a good use of your resources. It saps your own resources, which you could be using to fight a war on the outside of your borders. It drives out talent, and also, it's morally reprehensible and wrong. The idea of an atomic bomb had been brought to Hitler, but Hitler looked into it and then decided it wasn't worth the commitment of resources because the U.S. spent an equivalent of $1 trillion on this project alone, right? And Hitler didn't have that kind of resources. I mean, he's fighting a war on three fronts. And so he thought that basic, like more traditional military technology of like normal missiles was a better investment. And chances are that Hitler really wouldn't have been able to develop it because of some of the leading minds he had driven out of the country, like Einstein, Oppenheimer, etc. This project was so top secret that even people who were working on it didn't necessarily know that that's what they were working on, because it was so compartmentalized. Women played a role in that as well, as scientists and secretaries and other such things, but often, again, didn't know exactly what they were working on. So there's a formal ceremony, September 2nd, 1945, where Japan officially kind of formally surrenders. And the Tojo will be convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death, and he will be hanged. The Japanese military will be forced to accept full responsibility. In Tojo, will be forced to accept full responsibility for the actions during World War II. But Japan will never really apologize for those things. Hirohito will keep his position, so the emperor will stay in power, and I'll talk to you about that in a couple more slides. But the U.S. is the only country to have ever used atomic weaponry, ever in war. So other countries have tested atomic weapons, but the United States is the only country to have intentionally used atomic weapons in a time of war to kill people. So the bombs were called Little Boy and Fat Man, just so you know those references. They're atrocious. The death toll here is terrible, although not as bad actually as the firebombing, but we did it with 2 bombs as opposed to the thousands of firebombs that were dropped. And in the blink of an eye. The death toll, you detonate an atomic bomb above the surface of the ground so that it maximizes the area of the blast radius. Inside the initial area of the explosion, people are vaporized. So these are permanent shadows that have been left. And actually, if you go back here, there's another one where people were just vaporized. And so their bodies kind of absorbed some of that energy from this blast, and it shielded the pavement behind it a little bit, and so created this permanent shadow, whereas everything else was exposed to this blinding light directly. So those are the permanent shadows. The towns themselves are leveled, right? These used to be big cities, and now they're not. And of course, if you don't die immediately, there are terrible, just absolutely terrible impacts on the human body. Radiation burns. People died painful deaths over the course of days because of this. And then for years to come, you will see the radiation causing not only radiation poisoning, but irradiating soil, causing cancers, leukemia, and the like. So when the United States, years later, created a commemorative stamp that had the atomic bomb on it, there was backlash for obvious reasons, because while this may be a technological accomplishment, it is a weapon of mass destruction and death and human suffering, and probably should not be held up as something to be celebrated and put on stamps, which stamps are officially U.S. currency. Yeah, okay. This sets us up for the Cold War. The end of this war, part of the motive for using the atomic bomb, as I said, was to stop the Soviet advance in the Pacific and to contain communism. Right? The Soviet Union is shocked. It is absolutely blindsided by this. It didn't know that the United States was developing this weapon, even though we were allies. So it feels betrayed and lied to and threatened, because all of a sudden the United States has this kind of world-ending type of technology. So it's going to seek to develop its own, and it will within a couple years, and that'll just ramp up tensions even farther between the two superpowers. Um, the Soviets will occupy Manchuria and North Korea, and we will talk about the Korean War when we get to the Cold War. Um, the one of the stated goals from Truman for dropping the atomic bomb and causing such mass destruction was to stop the Soviets in their tracks, right? To not give them an excuse to invade Japan. The USA will be responsible for rebuilding Japan because, again, the agreements at Yalta and Potsdam. It will take away the Japanese military. It will not be allowed. The Japanese will not be allowed to have a military. It was only a few years ago that Japan voted to overturn that provision in its constitution and can now start remilitarizing. Something that you can imagine was not a very welcome development for Korea and China and other Asian countries in the area. Because the last time Japan had a military, it created an empire. The Japanese flag has changed to the rays of the sun reaching out. Imperial Japan, building that empire, reaching beyond its home islands, are taken away, and now it is the rising sun, the land of the rising sun still, but just the sun, not reaching out. Japan is presented with sort of a new version of history, and so this is where I want to talk to you about the emperor staying in power. The emperor will keep his position because it is in the United States' interest for him to do so. So the U.S. is looking to rebuild Japan, and it's dealing with a shell-shocked Japanese populace who's still highly nationalistic. To make it easier, it would help the United States to have an authority figure that the people are already used to obeying. We have talked about this before in a specific kind of colonialism. What type of colonialism seeks to use pre-existing native governments to facilitate the colonial country's rule? Yeah, it's indirect rule. And so that's sort of the model that the USA will be looking to implement here. Tojo will be singled out as the military leader and the person responsible and the prime minister. And the United States will pitch a story to the Japanese people that says it wasn't the Japanese people's fault. It wasn't the rest of the government. It wasn't the emperor's fault. He was sidelined. He was turned into just a puppet. He was powerless in the face of the military. The military seized control of the country and did all these terrible things. And so it is okay for the emperor to stay in power. And the Japanese people bear no real responsibility here. And that story makes rebuilding Japan easier for the United States. It facilitates the traditional authority structure, Japanese emperor in charge. The United States will remake the government, redesign the Constitution, rebuild the economy in, again, a capitalist industrial image. Make Japan a capitalist ally in the coming war, the coming Cold War. And a close ally. And the United States will promise to be its big brother. Japan, you don't need a military because the U.S. will have your back and we'll make sure that nobody attacks you, but of course also no, you won't get to attack anybody else. But that said, this is why Japan has yet to reconcile its past. It hasn't reckoned with it. It has not apologized to China for the rape of Nanjing. It hasn't made amends with the other countries that it imperialized and brutalized. And this lack of a Japanese understanding in the history books, it's not taught that these atrocities aren't really covered. They're treated as, yes, there were some things that happened, but that's what happens in war. That should remind you of other things. What other cases can we look at that is similar to? Yeah, hopefully it reminds you of the Armenian genocide between the Turks against the Armenians. It should hopefully remind you about America and its treatment of Native Americans. Recently, I mean, this has caused problems, I've said, between Japan and China still. It's also caused problems between Japan and Korea. So the Korean Prime Minister made comments about within 6 or 7 years ago at this point, saying that Korean comfort women, and these were women that Japanese soldiers forced into sexual slavery during the Korean occupation, that the comfort women, the Korean people should be proud, and those women should feel proud and honored that they were able to serve the Japanese army in its time of need. Right? I mean, that is tone deaf is an understatement. Obviously, to the Korean people, this was a massive human rights violation, a war crime, a war atrocities. And to have the prime minister saying that the Korean people should be proud of this and feel grateful for the opportunity to serve the Japanese forces is outrageous. And it caused a big diplomatic problem between the two countries, that was South Korea and Japan. Um, and this is because of a fundamental misunderstanding in Japan about their own history and their inability to reconcile with what they've done, right? Or what, at this point, what their ancestors did. But, so again, you might be able to understand now why, when Japan voted to have a military again, the surrounding countries were very unhappy with that, because it's not only did the last time they have a military they invaded other countries, but they haven't reconciled with that history of those invasions either. So if you haven't learned from your own history, you're that much more likely to repeat it. Okay, so this brings us to the end of World War II, which is a good stopping point. Things I didn't cover. Specific battles in the Pacific. I mentioned some of them, I glossed over them pretty quickly. The Bataan Death March I mentioned very in passing. Same thing with the kamikaze raids, the war in Indonesia campaigns, like the details of what's going on in Vietnam, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, etc. We just didn't have time to cover. Assume it was pretty brutal. Specific military leaders, including General Douglas MacArthur, and several others. A whole bunch of other stuff, essentially. Again, long story short, this took us multiple days to get through, and still, it's such a big war. There's so much to cover, and just didn't have time to do it all. So, fortunately for this period of history, there are so many resources and so many documentaries that if you want to learn more, there's really nothing stopping you, and probably have time to do it. So, all right. Next time we will look at the Holocaust, and then we'll start looking at the Cold War and Chinese communism, and get ourselves to the end of the year.